Facts First presents 100 years after a giant molasses wave hit Boston, the disaster haunts locals in a truly bizarre way. Boston is the capital of Massachusetts and the spiritual capital of New England. In terms of its physical size, it's actually pretty small. It's an old town with streets that are so narrow they're easier to walk on than to drive on. The Puritans established the city in 1630, and it played a significant part in the Revolutionary War. Today, it remains a major center for education, science, medicine, and culture. During the 1800s, Boston's population increased dramatically as Irish, Jewish, and Italian immigrants moved there from Europe. During the 20th century, Puerto Ricans and African Americans settled in Boston after the Second World War. Today, Boston's still growing and changing all the time. Officials have been working to honor the city's history, which includes remembering the Boston Molasses Flood. You heard me right, the Boston Molasses Flood. 100 years later, this disaster is still haunting locals in a very bizarre way. Boston is known as Beantown, and the reason for that is for a while molasses was imported to the city from the Caribbean, and it was the main ingredient in Boston-baked beans. In 1910, Boston Harbor was the final destination for ships from the Purity Distilling Company, which was a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, and it was there the ships would unload the molasses that was transported from Cuba, the West Indies, and Puerto Rico. Millions of gallons of molasses were coming into the harbor, and even more came through when the war started. Molasses could be distilled into alcohol, which could be used for ammunition, such as dynamite. It was heavily in demand during the war, and USIA owned a distillery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They needed a place to store the unloaded molasses before they could transfer it, and they chose the north end of Boston. The area was overcrowded and made up of 90% Italian immigrants. The people there were poor, and they didn't have much political power, so it was easy for a big corporation to move in and do what they wanted. In 1915, USIA built a 4-story tank on Commercial Street, which was opposite of Copp's Hill. The tank was built in a hurry. It was 50 feet tall, 90 feet across. The tank leaked continuously, too, and attempts were always being made to reseal it. A maintenance worker named Isaac Gonzalez often would rush to the tank in the middle of the night to make sure the tank hadn't burst. Workers would often take pieces of broken steel to the firm's office to prove it wasn't safe, but the USIA continued to ignore them. On the day of the flood, the tank was filled almost to capacity, which rarely ever happened. Around lunchtime on January 15th, the tank exploded. Over 2.3 million gallons of molasses flooded the streets. It was reported there was a 160-foot wide wave that was between 15 and 40 feet high. There was no escaping the huge molasses wave, and it swallowed up everyone and everything in its path. Anyone who's ever heard the phrase, "as slow as molasses," they know that it's denser than water, it's thick, it makes it move more slowly. But if you understand physics, you know it can move very quickly with the force of a mudslide or lava flowing from a volcano. On the day of the flood, the temperatures were mild for that time of year. It didn't spread as fast as it would have if it were summer, so it remained contained to a 2-block radius. When the sun went down and the temperatures dropped, it hardened around everything, and chisels and saws were necessary in order to break it apart. There was plenty of casualties after the flood. Part of the tank burst and fell on an elevated train track. One car was driven by the force toward a nearby worker. A boy named Pascal Iantosca was gathering firewood at the time of the flood. He was 10 years old at the time, and his father Giuseppe was watching him from the window. He was wearing a red sweater, so he was hard to miss. When the molasses wave came, it consumed the boy. When rescuers found his body, he had a broken pelvis, 2 broken arms, and his sweater was molasses brown. He was one of the 21 people who were killed, 18 of them Italian immigrants or Irish workers. As if the casualties themselves weren't enough, over 150 other people were injured. While a 78-year-old woman watched her house being swallowed up, she suffered a broken jaw. Her sister was severely disfigured and then suffered a massive stroke. It took days for the authorities to find her body. One man was swept 35 feet by the molasses, and he survived by holding on to a ladder. Many of the victims couldn't breathe because their lungs had filled with molasses. The flood was so severe it took days and months for the people who died to be found. It took 11 days for Flaminio Gallerani to be found, and a wagon driver named Cesar Nicolo wasn't pulled from the Molasses for 4 months. Eventually, the flood led to the first class action lawsuit against a major corporation, and the victims of the flood won. USIA was ordered to pay the plaintiffs $628,000. There are many people who believe that the tiny plaque that exists to remember those who died in the tragedy isn't enough. It's the second biggest disaster in Boston in regards to fatalities, second only to the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in 1942 that killed 492 people. On a hot summer day in Boston, you can still smell the sweet odor in the North End. Subscribe for more.